everybody, it's Victoria, and today I'm going to be telling you all of my favorite classics. I've been wanting to do this video for quite some time now, but I felt like I needed to kind of reread all the classics I'd ever read so that I would give you an accurate top 10 list. However, I realized that that's unrealistic, and so some of these books I'm strictly going on my memory and having good memories of them, and books that I think made an impact on me, especially in my youth and throughout high school and even before high school and college. So a lot of these books I do think I need to reread and see if they're still my favorite books. But as it stands right now, this is my top 10 list for classics. Coming in at number 10, I'm going to go with Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. This one is one of those that's number 10 because I don't remember every detail of this. I'm very familiar with the story, and obviously thanks to the musical as well. I'm a big fan of the musical, but I also remember this being probably the biggest classic I ever picked up when I was in high school on my own, unprompted. I didn't have to read it for school or anything. I just wanted to read it because I loved the musical. It's also, as you probably know, a book set in the French Revolution, which is one of my favorite time periods to read about and to learn about. And even in high school, I was fascinated with the time period, and I really liked learning about France and, sorry, I just bumped the camera. I really loved learning about France and European history in general. So this was a classic that had a big impact on me, and it's also a great story. In my number 9 spot, I have North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is a book that I had to read for college. I was an English major for maybe the first 2 years of college, and then I ended up switching because I decided I wanted to do a music education major, and I simply couldn't do both. I had to kind of pick one because I would just not have had enough hours to devote to reading and writing for my English major, so I ended up just switching over to music education. Long story short, this was in the very last class that I had to take when I was doing my English major. It was British literature class, and I really adored that class, and North and South is one of the books that made me fall in love with British literature to this day. This follows our main character, Margaret Hale, who is a woman who is settling into an industrial town of, what is it called, Milton. This book's main themes are on class and gender and responsibility to your society, particularly what was the changing society of the industrial period. At the time, it was a historical period that I didn't know a lot about, and so North and South really got me interested in learning more about the industrial period as well. Elizabeth Gaskell is just a fantastic writer, and I desperately need to reread this because, again, so many details are lost on me now. This is high on my reread list. In spot number 8, we're gonna go with Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I love the story of Frankenstein so much, and I always loved the old black and white monster movie Frankenstein, but reading the book was a whole other experience, and as you might know, the book and the movie are very different and follow almost completely different storylines in most ways. I'm so enthralled with Mary Shelley's exploration of being the creator and creation in the hands of man and what kind of implications that has for society. I love Frankenstein because it wrestles with so many topics and moral issues that our current society also wrestles with, and so I find it so remarkable that a book written in this time period, 1800s I think, is relevant in the modern age. I think it's just amazing. Speaking of books that wrestle with morality, in spot number 7 is going to be 1984 by George Orwell. I actually pretty recently read this, I think maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, something like that. Very recent. And I am still haunted by the ending of this book and the last 50 pages or so. I am to this day horrified when I think about it. And it is something to be said when a book can stick in your mind that well, and a scene can just grip you and not let go. Another book that I just feel was ahead of its time, and George Orwell is just so brilliant. If you don't know much about 1984, it is set in a post-apocalyptic world, and the theme of Big Brother is introduced in this classic book. And so, you know, Big Brother is always watching. Big Brother is the government, and no one really has privacy anymore, and people are encouraged to believe in nonsense, essentially, and encouraged to ignore history, and they change the facts of history so that, you know, no one really knows the truth anymore, and it is just an amazing read. George Orwell was just such a brilliant mind, and while this book is very bleak, it will always stick with me, and I don't think I can forget many of the very bleak and gruesome images, and I have to give it credit for that. In spot number 6 is also a book that I really need to reread because details out the window, but that is A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. This book is one I had to read in high school, like many people did. It was this my first Dickens? May have been my second Dickens. I think my first Dickens book was Christmas Carol, I'm pretty sure. But this was my first, like, serious Dickens. And so I fell in love with Dickens' writing and his characterization, and there's just so many classic, beautiful lines and quotable, memorable writing that I could not include it, even though I don't remember a lot about the plot, and I really do need to reread this. I know that it is also set in the French Revolution, and apparently I need to brush up on my fiction from that time period because I read these in high school, and high school was many years ago now. But the book made my list because it introduced me to Dickens, who is definitely one of my favorite authors of all time. This list wouldn't be complete without some books from my childhood, and so for number 5, I'm going to go with Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery. This is a book that I read late elementary school, middle school, who knows, but it was the right time to read it, and Anne is just such a lovable character, and so spunky, and you're just so sympathetic for her and her situation, and she has endless optimism, and that is just a life lesson that is so important, especially for young people, and this was just a great book for me to have read at the time. This really needs a reread. I also would love to continue with the series because there are more books in the Anne universe. I actually put this book in my TBR jar that I pick out once a month because I do genuinely want to get to this again and refresh my memory on this. But I just had to include it because it was such an important book for me when I was a child. In spot number 4, I have a feeling a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this one, but what I think has got to be my favorite Shakespeare is Romeo and Juliet. And this is such an important book for me because first of all, it was my first Shakespeare ever, and I read it as a freshman in high school, just like many people did, who, if you live in America, at least, that's kind of, I think, when you read it is when you're a freshman. It introduced me to the world of Shakespeare, and Shakespeare is just one of my favorites. I enjoy reading Shakespeare. I enjoy watching Shakespeare. What I fell in love with Shakespeare was his wordplay and kind of hidden double meanings in text. That just fascinated me and is one of the reasons why I wanted to become an English major. And unfortunately, I wish I had stuck with the English major, I really do, but my life took me in different places. But this was one of the reasons that I wanted to study literature, and I attribute it to me being a more critical reader and reading between the lines and reading in historical context. And I just have to love Romeo and Juliet for that, even though Romeo and Juliet as a couple are quite ridiculous, in my opinion. I think the book itself was so very valuable for me, and that's why it's so high up on this list. I would be remiss if I did not include C.S. Lewis on my list as one of my favorite authors, and this is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, although really I should put just the whole Chronicles of Narnia series in this spot number 3. This book has a unique ability to make me feel at home, but also to transport me, and it always feels new when I reread this book. I'm actually currently rereading this book, and it always feels new and interesting and fresh, and I feel like I always get something else out of it. I probably read the Chronicles of Narnia when I was in middle school, I'm thinking, and so that was just a really important time for me as a reader. This introduced me to fantasy. This may have been the first fantasy series that I've read. So thank you, C.S. Lewis, for being the gateway drug into fantasy. In spot number 2 is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I've seen a lot of people kind of complain about Mr. Rochester as a character and how kind of chauvinistic he is a little bit, and how he doesn't really treat Jane very well. But honestly, I don't really care. I mean, I do, but I still love this book regardless. Jane Eyre is one of the first classics that I read on my own, didn't read it for school, that I felt was so very readable and so easily accessible. I love Jane as a character. That's probably why I love this book so much, is because of Jane. And maybe I saw myself in Jane in some ways, in her personality. And I do think it's one of my favorite romances of all time is between Jane and Mr. Rochester. And then the whole crazy lady in the attic was really shocking to me as a young person reading this novel, high schooler reading this novel. I didn't really know anything about it, and so that kind of blew my mind a little bit, that a classic could kind of shock me and surprise me in that way. While this is very high up on my list, I do realize I haven't read this in many years, and I really should reread it and see if it's still this high on my list. And now finally, at number 1, I gave this a lot of thought, and I think I kept coming back to The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. First of all, I want to say that I recognize the flaws in The Lord of the Rings as being quite slow-paced a lot of the time and hard to get into sometimes, and there's just some dry spots in it. There's just some barren wastelands of passages that you just have to push through. But I would say this is the classic that was really a turning point for me as a serious reader. To have a world so vast and so detailed as The Lord of the Rings is really unheard of in most other literary genres. I hear Brandon Sanderson is kind of changing the game of fantasy. I haven't read Brandon Sanderson yet, but boy do I want to. But anyways, that's for another video at another time. The Lord of the Rings has to be one of the biggest undertakings I ever took on as a reader on my own. I'm not sure when I read it, but definitely maybe over the summer in college. I think I was in college, but I just remember not being able to put it down because I was just so fascinated with the details of the world and the unfolding of the story, and the bond between the characters is just so strong and magical and amazingly crafted, and it's a classic for a reason. It launched really a whole fantasy genre, and it's absolutely near and dear to my heart. I need to reread it, of course. I need to reread all of these books. Alright, so as it stands, that is my top 10 for classics, and I'm sure this list is going to change. I have many classics on my TBR shelf, and I'm sure that maybe 1 or 2 of these might get bumped someday, especially upon rereads. But classics are amazing, and I love them so much, and I will always read classics, and I hope you do too. Thank you so very much for watching this. I hope you got a few recommendations out of it. Let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these. Give me your top classic books of all time. I'm sure that I've missed many classics so far in my lifetime, and I just need to keep reading, so I'm always open for recommendations. Thank you so much for watching, and until my next video, I'll chat with you in the comments. Bye-bye.